What happened to someone after they died? In most modern Western cultures, we have a pretty standardized answer to that question. A funeral, a casket, maybe some flowers, a cemetery plot, done. But for the vast majority of human history, death was treated radically differently, and not always in the ways you might expect. Let's start with what seems obvious: burial. People buried their dead, right? They dug holes, put bodies in them, covered them up. Simple. Except it wasn't, not really, because some of the earliest evidence of intentional burial doesn't come from a time when humans had figured out how to effectively dig holes. Neanderthals, 130,000 years ago, somehow found ways to position their dead in specific locations within caves. We don't fully understand how they did this without proper tools, but they did it carefully, which suggests something radical. They cared about what happened next. This wasn't just discarding remains. This was ritual. But here's where it gets interesting. Not all ancient humans buried their dead. In fact, most of them didn't. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, for tens of thousands of years, practiced exposure. They would leave their dead on platforms, exposed to the elements and scavengers. But this wasn't neglect. The body was placed in specific locations, often in trees, and attended to over months as decomposition occurred. Some groups would even collect the bones afterward and incorporate them into tools or ornaments. The dead weren't gone, they were transformed, made into something that could be touched, carried, integrated back into the living community. Pacific Islander cultures practiced similar approaches. Bodies would be laid out in canoes or structures that allowed exposure, but again with intention and ritual significance. Death wasn't an ending, it was a transition that required the community's participation. Then there's excarnation, and yes, that's a real word. It means removing the flesh from bones. The Zoroastrians, thousands of years ago, believed that fire and earth and water were sacred elements that couldn't be contaminated with corpses, so they built towers called Towers of Silence. Bodies were brought to the top. Vultures and other scavengers would consume the flesh. The bones, stripped clean, would eventually be collected and placed in stone ossuaries below. This wasn't morbid, it was spiritual. The body was returned to nature in the most direct way possible. Some cultures took this even further. Excarnation combined with processing. The Tibetan sky burial tradition involved cutting and processing bodies so they could be more easily consumed by vultures. This wasn't disrespect, it was the highest form of honor. The body was offered to the sky, feeding the creatures that inhabited it. But there's more: cremation. We think of it as modern, a practical alternative to burial, but it's ancient. Some of the earliest evidence of cremation appears around 20,000 years ago, not as a substitute for burial, but as a complete alternative ritual. The fire wasn't just destroying the body, it was transforming it, releasing something. The ashes might be scattered in significant locations, mixed into soil, buried in vessels. The act of burning was sacred because the body was becoming something else entirely. And then there's what we might call the most unsettling to modern sensibilities: secondary burial, keeping the dead around, not in refrigeration, not in some sterile way, but present. Some cultures would leave bodies in homes, positioned to face certain directions, sometimes for weeks before secondary rituals. The Australian Aboriginal practice of taphonomy often involved keeping remains in the camp, repositioning them, handling them, singing to them. The dead were still community members, just in a different state. What's crucial to understand is that none of these practices were born from lack of understanding or resources. They weren't the result of ancient humans not knowing better. They were deliberate choices based on completely different beliefs about what death meant and what happened to a person after they died. To a modern Western person, the idea of leaving a body on a platform or processing it for vultures seems primitive, disrespectful, even horrifying. But that assumption reveals more about us than about them. We believe the dead should be sealed away, protected, placed in the ground, or turned to ash. We believe in preservation and separation, but many ancient cultures believed the opposite.
The dead should be integrated, consumed, scattered, made part of the ongoing world instead of separated from it. The real question isn't what did ancient humans do with their dead? The real question is, what does our treatment of death say about how we view the world, continuity, and whether we see the dead as forever removed from us or somehow still present?
Because the more you look at ancient burial practices, the more you realize every culture, including ours, is answering something deeply personal with whatever ritual they choose.